Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 8. By way of review, we remember that the Apostle Paul is explaining what it means to give acceptable service to God. Remember Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not fashioned according to the world, but be transformed. So the idea is he's going to tell us what it is that we are to do. In the chapter before chapter 12, remember going all the way back to chapter 10 and verse 21, the reason many Jews had been cut off from Christ was because of their disobedience. And then we came to chapter 11 and verse 22, and he says, Behold then the goodness and severity of God towards them that fell severity, but towards you God's goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also shall be cut off. So the question is, what do we do? What is this good thing or good work that we do? And this is something that the Bible in the New Testament reveals. Some people say, well, there are no works that we are to do for salvation. But quite to the contrary, the New Testament reveals everywhere works that must be done in order to be acceptable to God and not be cut off as opposed to being attached to Christ. So one passage or two passages we'll look at just to suffice it at Ephesians. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 2 in verse 10. After the Apostle Paul said that we're saved by grace and not from any works of our own, he makes a statement about works to do. So the conclusion is obvious. The works one is not to do are works of their own making, their own doing. So at verse 10, Ephesians 2 and verse 10, he says, For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God afore prepared that we should walk in them. So this is the objective of the Christian, to perform good works. Then again, at Titus chapter 2 and verse 14, the same Apostle Paul writes, Who gave himself for us, that's Christ, gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good works. At Titus chapter 3 and verse 8, Faithful is the saying, and concerning these I desire that you affirm confidently to the end that they who have believed God may be careful to maintain good works. Over and over. It's all over the place. So Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, remember the idea is obedience to righteousness, disobedience to condemnation. It's all over the place. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. The gospel saves if you continue in its instructions and obedience. So again, it's all over the place. But the question that we're concerned about is, what is it that we are to obey? What works are we to do? And so Paul is delineating those things at chapter 12, and then we move into chapter 13, and we see that there's something else that God expects for us to do, and that is that we would obey the civil authorities that are over us. So let's look at Romans chapter 13 and verse 1 and discuss this. He says, Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, that is, be obedient to those that are in high positions of authority. For, he says, there is no power or authority but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. So all the authorities that exist today, and in the context, we have to kind of jump ahead. He doesn't state it at this moment, but it will become evident as we continue through chapter 13, that the civil authorities, magistrates, police officers, the court system, our governor, our mayors, governors, the President of the United States for our country, all of these authorities are under consideration. Civil rule is what's under consideration here, and the command is to obey rather than disobey. So as we will see in this study, it is a matter of obeying God to obey the civil authorities that are over us. So these powers, these authorities, he says, are ordained of God. That is, they are appointed by him to do this work. And that's very significant. Look what he says at verse 2 then. Romans 13 and verse 2. Therefore, okay, seeing that God has ordained or appointed these civil rulers, therefore, that word therefore there in the Greek expresses a result or an effect of the action in the principal clause. So the principal clause is that there are these authorities, higher authorities, that have been ordained by God. And this word expresses the result with emphasis in relationship to their being ordained by God. Maybe that's a little too much explanation, but you can see in the notes there or on the slide to my left the Greek word there, oste. And any rate, so he says, therefore, he that resists the power, the authorities that have been ordained by God. To resist something is to set oneself against it. If it is an individual's objective to disobey the law, then there will be consequences. He says, therefore, he that resists, sets yourself against the authority, withstands God. That is, you set yourself against God. You set yourself against civil authorities, then you're setting yourself against God. Well, why is that? Well, he says such a one withstands the ordinance of God, or the injunctions, the rules, the laws of God. And they that withstand or set themselves up against the laws of God shall receive to themselves judgment. This is fascinating. So what he's saying is that if you disobey law, and later as we'll see, if you do not reverence or honor those that have been ordained of God or appointed of God to serve in these civil authority positions, if it is the case that you disdain them, that you disobey them, then you're disobeying God. You're disobeying His rules. Again, this is very fascinating, and in such case, there's nothing but judgment that awaits such an individual. Now we move to Romans chapter 13 and verse 3. He says, for, using the Greek gar to express the reason for this judgment, you violate the law of the civil authorities, then you're violating God's rules and you're subject to judgment. And now he says the reason, he says, for that is that rulers, now he's going to give several reasons here. This is what's fascinating about this, several reasons here. So first of all, we see rulers, that is, the ones that have been ordained or appointed by God, the civil authorities. These rulers are not a terror to those that do good work, but to those that do evil. So once again, we get back to the issue of good versus evil, doing works that are right versus wrong. And when one does an action that is wrong, that's called sin, or in this case, he refers to it as evil. So if I violate law, if I run through a stop sign, if I run through a red light, if I refuse to pay a parking ticket, if I do not pay my taxes, if I steal from my neighbor, if I murdered someone, there are going to be consequences to those. Those are sinful, evil works. That's the Bible language. So he says, rulers, these authorities are not to be feared to those who do good, those that obey the law, but rather to those that do evil, those that disobey the law. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about at the very end of chapter 10. Many of the Jews were cut off from Christ because of their disobedience. And so he's continuing on this issue of obedience, of works to do as opposed to works not to do. And then the second part of chapter 13 and verse 3 says, and would you have no fear of the power? Is it your objective to not fear the power? Then he says, do that which is good, and you shall have praise from the same. So obey the law. Don't steal things. Don't take things that don't belong to you. Don't violate the traffic signals that will find you getting pulled over by a police officer and ticketed or fined. Pay your taxes. Don't do things that are unlawful. And if you do things that are good, then you don't have anything to fear. Because the law, the civil authorities, those in power that God ordained, are there for a purpose to keep civil order. And when I'm conducting myself in a civilly orderly manner, lawfully, a law-abiding citizen, then there's nothing to fear. But if I'm going to do things that violate the laws of the land, of the civil authorities, then there's plenty to fear. And so he talks about this here at verse 4. Romans chapter 13 and verse 4, he says, here's the reason. Why should you fear if you do evil? For he, that is the ruler, the one that occupies the divinely ordained position of authority in civil circles, he is a minister, that is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid. Now, if you're doing what's good, there's no reason to fear them. But if you are doing evil, if you're disobeying the law, then there's plenty to be afraid of, he says. For, here's why you'd be afraid. For he bears not the sword in vain, that is without purpose or heedlessly. The object of the sword is punishment. And he says, for he is a minister of God, an avenger, that is one that inflicts punishment for wrath to him that does evil. Again, this is the individual that violates civil law. The works of this individual are disobedience. If you are having trouble seeing this, then what you need to go back to is Romans chapter 6 and verse 16. And then even before that, go to verse 14 and see that we are under grace, not under the law of Moses. Being under something means to be subject to something. Being subject to something means to be obedient to it. This is what's under consideration, the idea of subjection. At chapter 13, verse 1, he says, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers that be, to be obedient to them. Likewise, we are to be in subjection to God. We are to obey him. What are we to obey? Romans chapter 6, verse 1 through 7. We obey baptism, for example. This is a commandment of God. Verse 7, this is how we're justified. What else do we do? Well, Romans chapter 12 gives us a whole lot of things to do. Passages like Romans chapter 2, or Romans chapter 1 and 2 give us a whole lot of things that we should not do. And so here in Romans chapter 13, we're seeing something that we're to do and not do as well. We are to obey the civil authorities. We are not to disobey them. So if we obey them, there's nothing to fear. If we disobey them, there's plenty to fear, because they do not bear the sword of punishment in vain. They are the ones that inflict punishment. So don't ignore stop signs, the traffic signals. Do not take things that do not belong to you. Do not violate the civil law that you are under, and everything will be well. If you do, however, you may find yourself even in jail. Some have even committed high crimes of murder, espionage, treason, or drug-related drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and all of those types of things, or even do capital punishment, death, the death penalty. So I don't have to worry about that as long as I'm a law-abiding citizen. And as I obey the laws of land, then what I'm doing is obeying the laws of God. And that's what he gets at verse 5, Romans chapter 13 and verse 5. He says, wherefore, this is the Greek dio, and it means on which account. On account of the fact that the civil authority ordained by God does not bear the sword of punishment in vain, on that account you must needs be in subjection. Not only because of wrath, but now he gives another reason. You're in subjection, you obey them because there is this situation of wrath. There are consequences to violating law, right? But here's another reason. He says, you also obey them for conscience sake. And the idea of the conscience is an inward moral impression, a feeling, a notion, or thought of one's actions and principles. So we have a conscience, our inner mind that is pricked, if you will, is caused to feel guilt when we do things that are wrong, as opposed to doing what is right. Our conscience is doing well when we do what's right. It's not doing so well when we're doing things that we know that are wrong. So obey the laws of the land, subject yourself to the civil rulers, the authorities that are ordained of God for conscience sake. Well, he explains this. Let's keep going. At verse 6, Romans 13 and verse 6, for this cause, here we have the Greek dio and gar together, which enforces the reason of being in subjection to the authorities. For this cause, okay, be in subjection to authorities, not just for wrath, the idea that they punish the evildoers, but also for conscience sake. For this cause, you pay tribute also. for they are ministers of God's service, attending continually upon this. Now, the word tribute here is a general term for tax. We're taxed in a society for many different things. You go to the store, you purchase groceries, you pay tax. You go to the hardware store, you purchase something, you pay a tax. You purchase a home, you pay tax. You sell stocks and bonds, stocks, you're going to pay tax, capital gains. There's tax all over the place. So this tribute is a general tax, and in a moment we're going to see a more specific tax. So for this cause you pay tribute also, for they are ministers of God. Now at verse 4 he talked about, or he identified these civil authorities as ministers from the perspective of being God's servants. This English word minister here is actually from a different Greek word, liturgos, which is not the idea of a servant. Well, it is, I guess, the idea of a servant, but it's a total different Greek word. And it comes from the idea of the Roman lictors, which were public servants that were very similar to our police officers today. These were the ones that were responsible for keeping civil order, and they would punish those who were offenders of the law. So you pay tribute, for they are ministers of God's service, attending continually upon this very thing. So in other words, this is their work. This is what they're about on a daily basis. This is their full-time job, so to say. And people don't work for nothing. We see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Farmer gets paid. A soldier gets paid. And Paul's point is that if these others that are doing labors get paid, then so should preachers. And now at this point, though, he's talking about those that are in these civil authority positions. So pay your taxes is the point. There are taxes that are due. You pay the tribute that is due. Pay the tax that's due. That's God's laws. So sometimes people try to evade paying taxes. God says pay it. But let's keep talking about this. At Romans chapter 13 and verse 7 here, he says, render to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, and custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. I'm almost thinking that I've skipped a verse because it seems to have gone so fast, but this is the last verse we're going to be talking about in Romans 13, chapter 13, because it's such a short chapter, divided in two sections. So let me read this again. Romans chapter 13, verse 7. Render to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So let's discuss these things here. What we have is the Christian being commanded to be obedient to the civil authorities. First, because the authorities are doing a God-ordained work. Secondly, because they punish evildoers. Third, because they are to be obeyed for conscience sake. And then he tells us that we are to be in subjection to them. We are to obey them from the perspective of paying taxes, so that they can also be paid. So now he says, render to all their tribute. That is the tax money, taxes to them. And he gives a specific word here, custom to whom custom is due. And that word custom is a more specific tax, and it has to do with those of property or market taxes. So, for example, in our society, every year in, February the 1st, we have to pay our taxes on our homes, our property taxes. And then when you go to the market, you pay taxes there. Those are the customs. So don't avoid doing that. Don't try to get out of it. You can take advantage of whatever laws are there for those. For example, senior citizens get a tax break. But the point is, you pay your taxes. And that's the custom to whom custom is due. And this is the commandment of God. But he also says fear to whom fear is due. So this is the idea of terror or even panic fear. You should be afraid of those in positions of civil authority because of the fact that they do not bear the sword in vain. But then the last part of this, notice what he says here. He says, honor to whom honor is due. Now, this word honor means to carefully regard. And let's, as I read through this definition, think about our civil rulers today. You are ruled, you are under, you are in subjection to, you obey the civil authorities, which in our society you have on a local level, you have a mayor of a city. On a state level, you'll have a governor. On a national level, you'll have the president, the commander-in-chief. And then in between all of that, you have these civil authorities. You have police officers. We have a military for protection and so forth. So the first thing we think about when we look at the whole governance structure is that such a thing would cost quite a bit of money to run. So this is where much of our taxes go. So if I enjoy the freedoms that I have in this country, the country that I live in, I enjoy the protection and all the things that come with this society, the civil, not obedience, but the issue of civil rest, the peace, that's the word I'm trying to think, the civil peace that exists, this comes at a price. And so we pay that, and this is what God commands. Notice what he says, honor to whom honor is due. So think about all the structure of government we're under, from the president, commander-in-chief, to governors, to mayors, to all of these civil authorities. He says honor them. And that's something that you don't see a lot today, especially in our political circles today. The President of the United States is made fun of by many people. The civil authorities are walked over as though they are worthless. People are rioting in the streets and doing all kinds of protesting crazy things. So this is not showing honor. That's the point. And hopefully you see that. Well, what is honor? What does that mean? Honor to whom honor is due. Who's due the honor? The civil authorities that God has ordained, that God has appointed to this work. So if God appointed them to this work that they're doing, why would I want to disobey them? Why would I want to make fun of them? Why would I want to protest against them? It goes really without saying that if the government is commanding or demanding by law to do something that is against God's laws, then we don't do that. Acts chapter 5 gives a perfect example of that, where the civil authorities told Peter and the other apostles to no longer teach in the name of Jesus Christ. And you remember what Peter said, we'd rather obey God than man. Now, we will obey you, the civil authorities, but when that comes in conflict with God, we do not obey that. Okay, but what does it mean to honor? So the definition is, give careful regard, treat with dignity, veneration, respect, honor with reverent service. And that's Moulton in his word studies. So this is the disposition of, should be the disposition of all people, and especially of Christians, towards those that hold civil offices. Now, I'll close the study this morning by reading to you from 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 13 through 17. Listen carefully to what the Apostle Peter has to say about Christians honoring our civil government and the rulers of the land. The Apostle Peter said, be subject to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or unto governors as sent by him for vengeance on evildoers, and for praise to them that do well. Okay, I'll pause there. This sounds very familiar. It's exactly what we're looking at here at Romans 13, isn't it? But we continue at 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 15 now. He says, for so is the will of God, that by well-doing you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and not using your freedom as a cloak of wickedness, but as bondservants of God. Honor all men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. That's the instructions of God. So in this world that we live in, and as we watch television, the media, and listen to everyone dishonor the king, so to say, the civil rulers, let that not be the disposition of those that would be named Jesus Christ. We'll pick up with Romans chapter 13 and verse 8 at our next study. Thank you.